Sir Francis Bernard, Baron of Nettleham, was born in 1712, and after receiving education, including 7 years at Oxford, he eventually settled down in Lincoln, where he raised a family. In need of money to support his family, he eventually got a job in the Colonial Office, where he eventually became Governor of New Jersey and then Massachusetts. His rule of Massachusetts was pretty infamous, being the governor who attempted to enforce the various very unpopular taxation laws onto the colony. This unpopularity eventually culminated in 1768, with the colonists sending a petition to the British government to have him removed from office. The British government agreed, and Bernard returned to the UK. His removal as governor would not completely soothe the American colonists, and the situation in Massachusetts, particularly in Boston, would only escalate until things boiled over into the American Revolutionary War. Back in the UK, Bernard retained a position within the Colonial Office, and continued to advise the government throughout the Revolutionary War, until he got sick and had to retire, dying only 5 years after that. But why is he important to Nettleham? Well, after returning to the Americas, he was given the title Baron of Nettleham, along with some land in the village. At least that is what sources from Nettleham Village Council, which I'm using as my main source for these videos. When I was looking up extra information about Sir Francis Bernard, Wikipedia described him as a baronet, which are different things. Presuming that the Nettleham Parish Council is a more reliable source than Wikipedia, I went looking at the original source that Wikipedia cites. This only threw up more problems. The book that Wikipedia cites tells a completely different story, that he in fact acquired the land before he even became a governor in the Americas, with no mention of him being given a title. At this point, I'd spent an hour looking up the minutiae of this man's relationship to Nettleham, despite the fact that he'd likely never set foot here, and I was getting distracted from telling the actual history of the village. If this video somehow gets 1,000 likes, I will make a separate video delving into the personal history of Sir Francis Bernard. However, I have no desire to do so in this video. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about all the modern stuff in Nettleham's history. That is, for the stuff from about 300 years ago. This here was previously a watermill, which of course used the beck as a way to power their mill. This was from the 18th century, though I can't find any more specific dates than that. Another feature of the village that I find cool is that for some people, to get access to your house, you have to drive on through the beck. This is the Methodist church that was built in 1899 and has been in continuous use since then. This is the old school, built in 1859, as a way to educate the growing number of children in the village. The smaller building was a preschool that was built later on. The main centre of town, where these houses are, there used to be a garage. Further along we have all the services of the village, pharmacy, little shops. This is the building I want to start with because it links back to the Bishop's Palace. The Bishop's Palace offered more services than just being the residence for the bishop. It also offered legal services to the local estates of Nettleham Hall and Riceholme Hall, just to the west of the village. With the Bishop's Palace now gone, these services need to be moved to a different location, and so in 1690 this building was constructed for that purpose. However, soon after that, the building was turned into a pub, which remains to this day. The land that Sir Francis Bernard owned was also just behind this building. On the other side of the road from this pub is the Institute. This was built in 1894, with funding having been provided by Mr. Herbert Torr, the owner of Riceholme Hall. The building was set up for whatever public purpose the parish deemed fit to use it for. However, primarily he intended it to be used as a space to supplement the old school that I mentioned earlier. Over the years it has been used for many purposes. One use of note was during World War I, when the Institute housed refugees from Belgium, until 1990. When it was sold privately and is now home to multiple different businesses. Over on the other side of the green, next to the co-op, sits the oldest house in the village, having been built in the 14th century, around the same time that Edward I came to visit and declare his son the Prince of Wales. Although the original house would have been constructed from thatch and mud. However, it's this building, now the pub The Black Horse, that leads me to a much wider conversation. Linking back to the church, as I was talking about last time, when Henry VIII and his government abolished the monasteries, they took away a much needed service from the general population. Before this, monasteries had acted as charity for the poor. Now those services were gone. These services being gone came at just the wrong time, as England's population started to increase rapidly, until in 1601 Queen Elizabeth and her government decided to do something about the issue, passing the Poor Law of 1601. The Poor Law of 1601 was a truly insignificant document for the general population of England, who remained the only form of welfare for the general population for the next 200 years. It handed the responsibility of caring for the very poor to the local parishes, who were given the authority to take in local tax revenue to pay for the maintenance of the very poor. And when I say the very poor, they had a very strict definition of exactly who would receive maintenance for their welfare. They were designated as the deserving poor, those who physically could not work, that being the very young, the very old, the sick, and the physically disabled. If you did not fall into one of those categories and were very poor despite being employed, tough luck. If you were unemployed through no fault of your own, tough luck. For those who were unemployed, this was a much worse situation, since the prevailing attitude among the elites was that if you were not in work and were in poverty, this was entirely your fault. Exterior economic issues be damned. This law and these attitudes would continue for the next 200 years. However, within that 200 years, things would change. Land around the village would be enclosed, being given out to private owners, where previously the land had been owned in common, which meant that the average person now found it more difficult to grow their own food if they didn't own any of this land. Enclosure and other changes in agriculture, however, did make farming more efficient, which meant there was more food available, which meant the populations increased. Equally, as time progressed, less people were required on the farmland, and so they went to urban centres instead, where they found work in the growing industrial economy that Britain was starting to produce. Industrialisation did not affect Lincolnshire as significantly as the changes in agriculture did. This is because industrialisation came very late to Lincolnshire. Whilst the city of Lincoln, and therefore the region, had been immensely important in the previous centuries because of the power of the church and its agricultural production, it was not best suited for industrial production. It did not have major ports. It did not have major coal mines. It did not have, until very late in the 19th century, a railway connecting it to the industrial economy that had developed elsewhere in the country. Despite this, the changes in agriculture still meant that the population increased significantly. This growth in population required more services to be built. See the school, now village hall. But it also increased the ranks of the urban poor. This process was occurring all across the country and was putting strain on the old poor law system, with costs going up exponentially. On the local level, local town and parish councils needed a way to deal with this mass of urban poor, and so they created a new institution, the workhouse. And this is what this building was, a workhouse constructed in 1827. Those who have heard of a workhouse before may think of Oliver Twist. However, this was not yet one of those institutions. It was a much smaller one, constructed without the central government's oversight and on a much smaller scale. The idea of a workhouse was based upon those still very common ideas that if someone was poor or in poverty, it was entirely their own fault, and that therefore they must be encouraged to be a better person and take themselves out of poverty themselves. This meant that workhouses were cruel institutions that gave these people a life that was only slightly better than living on the streets, with absolute minimal pay. In 1834, Parliament passed a law to try and resolve the exponentially increasing costs of the Poor Law with the 1834 Poor Law. This Poor Law centralised the running and organisation of workhouses and took them from locally constructed ideas to the state's official policy. This is where the workhouses described in Oliver Twist are constructed, much larger centrally run institutions in the major cities. Much like everywhere else, larger workhouses were constructed in the major cities of Lincoln and Louth, with the parish council of Nettleham being given instruction to shut down their workhouse in this village and send its occupants and any future occupants to the ones in Lincoln. Despite this instruction, it would still take another 3 years for the workhouse in Nettleham to be officially closed, where shortly after the building was transformed into a couple of houses and the pub, which it still remains to this day. Despite being a small village, World War I and World War II still affected its citizens. During the Second World War, 2 bombs fell in fields close to the village, but luckily did no damage. But the World Wars still had a cost for the village. 32 died in World War I. 2008 in World War II, with their names now immortalised on the village's war memorial. The most recent significant event in the history of Nettleham, apart from the exorbitant house prices, occurred in 2007 when the local beck flooded, flooding the entirety of the green and several roads. Apart from that, this was the history of Nettleham. I intend to turn this format into something of a series. Next time I will go look at Nettleham Hall, which itself is a completely separate entity, and from there slowly make my way out to the wider villages in rural Lincolnshire. But until the next time, I'll see you later.